नायकैकनायकं विनाशिते मदैत्यकं नदाशुभाशुनाशकं नमामि तं विनायकम् नमामि तं विनायकम् न केतरातिभीकरं नभो विकाकभास्वरं नमत्सुरारिनिर्जरं नतादिकापदुद्धरं सुरेश्वरं निधीश्वरं गजेश्वरं गणेश्वरं महेश्वरं समाश्रये परात्परं निरन्तरम् परात्परं निरन्तरम् समस्तलोकशङ्करं निरस्तदैत्यकुञ्जरं दरेतरोदरं वरं वरेवक्त्रमक्षरं कृपाकरं क्षमाकरं मुदाकरं यशस्करं मनस्करं नमस्कृतां नमस्करोमि भास्वरम् नमस्करोमि भास्वरम् अकिञ्चनादिमार्जनं चिरन्तनोक्तिभाजनं पुरारिपूर्वनन्दनं सुरारिगर्भचर्वनं प्रपञ्चनाशभीषणं धनञ्जयादिभूषणं कपोलदानवारणं भजे पुराणवारणं भजे पुराणवारणम् निगन्तकान्तिगण्डकान्तिमन्तकान्तकात्मजम् अचिन्त्यरूपमन्तहीनमन्तराय कृन्तनं कृतन्तरे निरन्तरं वसन्तमेव योगिनां तमेकदन्तमेव तं विचिन्तयामि सन्ततं निरन्तरे निरन्तरं वसन्तमेव योगिनां तमेकदन्तमेव तं विचिन्तयामि सन्ततम् विचिन्तयामि सन्ततम्.
The gods, the humans, and the asuras went to Prajapati. And they said to Prajapati, say something to us, teach us. And Prajapati said to the gods, da, da, da. And he said to them, have you understood? And they said, yes. You said to us, Dharmika, be controlled. And the human said, say something to us. Guess what he said? He said, duh, duh, duh. And he said to them, have you understood? And they said to him, yes, we've understood. You said, Dhamma, the generous, give. And the Asuras came to him and said, give us the teaching. And he said to them, you can do it this time. Well done. Duh. Well done. And he said to them, duh. And he said to them, have you understood? Have you understood? And they said, yes. You said to us, no, everyone, have compassion. And he said, you have understood. That's very good. I've got an excellent audience here. I've got some people who know the story, and some of you are looking just as puzzled as my colleagues were when I told them that story when I went to interview for my job. They also thought they got a complete nutcase on their hands. They were probably right. But now I tell that story to the beginning of my second year storytelling class. Only I tell it like this. There was this university lecturer, and her students came to her and they said, give us the teaching. And she said to them, this time in English, because last time it was in Sanskrit, ka, ka, ka. And she said to them, have you understood? And then they all went. I told them the original story first. Then I made them go away and I said, what do you want out of this course that begins with a K in English? They came up with some wonderful things this year. They said they'd like some creativity. They said they'd like some clarity. They said they'd like me to be concise. And they said a few other things as well. Well, they got a few of those, but not all of them. So that ancient story, over 3,000 years old, knows that teachers can only teach when students want to learn. It was the students who came to the teacher and said, say something to us, give us the teaching. It knows that students have different needs. All Prajapati said was the. And they each heard something different. They heard 3 different Sanskrit words. They heard the word for be disciplined, they heard the word for be generous, they heard the word for be compassionate. They each heard what they needed to know. And so that text knows that teachers have to take students' needs seriously. And I think that's just a magnificent story. It's one of my absolute favourites, because it shows right from some of the earliest texts that we have from India, that understanding of the teacher-pupil relationship and what is involved in it. And it's a story that's terribly important to the author I'm going to talk to you a little bit about tonight, Adi Shankara, who is a very amazing author who I will introduce you to in a moment. Okay, so there he is in the middle, and he's got 4 disciples around him. Now his 4 disciples, whose names are up there, but I don't think you really need to write them down, were called Sureshwara, Padmapada, Athamalika, and Durga. And they traditionally, as some of you will know, are associated with 4 of the great Shankara monks in India. And there is a tradition that Sureshwara was associated with Sringeri, Padmapada with Puri, and Hastamalika and Durga with Dwaraka and Badrinath. Now, in fact, the first evidence that we have for that is in the 14th century, which is a long, long time after Adi Shankara, the first Shankara, actually lived. Probably he lived around 700 CE. And what is important about this picture isn't the monks, but it's what he's doing there. So what is he doing in that picture? Go on, Sanjana. You're absolutely right, he's teaching them. How did you manage to work that one out? You're right. What was the clue in the picture? Absolutely right, yes. Anybody picked up any other clues? I think that's pretty good. Okay. So we know Shankara, sometimes called Adi Shankara, the first of the month, the centres of learning, but he is also called Shankaracharya, Shankara the teacher, or Shankara Pujapata. So somebody who's fit to worship as the teacher there. And so we're going to focus on him as a teacher tonight. Right, so let's find out a little bit. This is kind of technical stuff, okay, so just listen to it. We're going to find out what he actually wrote. Now, he belongs to a particular school called Advaita Vedanta. Okay, let's have all the grown-ups can participate in this one. Shall we ask them to put their hands up? Yeah, okay. All right, grown-ups. Who has heard of Vedanta? Excellent. It's always good to know your audience. I'm far off, you were honest. Right. Who's heard of Advaita Vedanta? Okay, more or less the same people. You can tell that poor guy did. He typed part of my thesis for me. He's terribly, terribly good on those disciples, because that was the chapter he typed. Okay. Right. The Vedanta school is a school which looks at the Upanishads. I think all of you will have heard of the Vedic texts. The Vedic texts have 4 layers, and the last of those layers are known as Upanishads, sometimes translated as secret teachings. And they come at the end, also at the culmination of the Veda. So the Vedanta school, the Vedanta school is the school which focuses on the texts that are the culmination of the Veda. And it has all sorts of different branches. One of those branches is Advaita, Vedanta. And Advaita, now then, this is where you have to be ever so clever. Usually I do this on the board, so you'll have to just imagine the spelling in your heads. Right, take off the at the beginning of that first word up there, all right? Just said Advaita, all right? Now then, you have to be ever so clever and see if you can tell me a word in any language you speak, which might be the same as Dry.
Dual.
Well done, that man there. That's dual in English, okay? Anybody give me anything? Zwei is cognate, yeah. Yeah, dual, yeah. Dual, yes. Okay, so there's all sorts. What does it mean, basically? How many? Two. It means two. So if Advaita means two, Advaita is like not two. So not two, one. Nothing other than. So in a minute, this is a puzzle, so you've got to keep it in your head. What is nothing other than? What is there nothing other than? I'm not even going to ask you yet. You'll have to hold the answer. Okay, so we're going to find out later on what he's talking about there. But for the moment, I'm just going to tell you about what he wrote. Okay, could we have the next? That's it, okay. So he wrote a lot of commentaries on these texts called the Upanishads, on probably 10 of them. Wrote separate commentaries on all of them, commentaries which have been translated down to this day, and are very, very beautiful and very, very brilliant in many places, and they really are a joy to read if you happen to like reading commentaries. Now, in the Vedanta school, there was a series of verses, very, very short verses, which summarised the school and summarised the teaching of the Upanishads, and they were known as the Brahma Sutras. Sutra means a thread, so it's the thread on which the verses of this school, the school which taught about Brahman, ultimate reality, the key verses of this school. And those verses summarised the Upanishads. So he wrote commentaries on the Upanishads. He wrote a commentary on this very, very enigmatic text, the Brahma Sutra, which is, those of you who've read it will know it's almost impossible to understand without a commentary. The verses are extremely short. First one begins, Adata Brahma. Now then, the desire to know will be inquired into Brahman. And he also wrote a commentary on a text that probably loads of you have read or know or have heard of, the Bhagavad Gita. He wrote a commentary on the Gita Varsha. And those were the three sets of texts that any Vedantin commentator had to actually write on. So he takes a verse and he explains each word and then he explains the sentences, and then he might give you, get really excited by this verse. He might write several pages of Sanskrit, giving you some more teaching. He also wrote a text called, or at least bits of a text called the Upanishads, the 1,000 Teachings, which has prose sections, that's into ordinary sentences, and it's got metric bits, that's bits that are in poetry. And those were the teachings that he gave on how to teach. So he also is attributed with loads and loads of other things, including the beautiful prayer that you sang at the beginning. But we're going to focus on what he teaches in these kinds of texts this evening. Okay, so 3 lots of commentaries and a teaching manual. And of course they are terribly important from a teaching point of view. All right, who knows who the 2 main characters are in the Bhagavad Gita? The scene is 2 sets of cousins in the Mahabharata about to go to war. Arjuna is there with Krishna as his charioteer, and Arjuna sees the people on the other side. And he realises that the people on the other side were his teachers, Drona, Krishna. And he says to Krishna, how can I fight them? They're my teachers. You wouldn't go and fight. Because they call you Dipaka. Yeah, Dipaka. You wouldn't go and fight Dipaka, would you? Terribly rude. You just don't go and fight your teacher. And for the rest of the Gita, Krishna explains to him how things really are. It's Krishna teaching Arjuna. So the Gita is all about, the Gita is all about teaching. Those other texts have got lots and lots of things to do with teaching, and perhaps we'll gloss over that for the moment. So now the question is, why am I interested in Shankara's teaching. Shankara, of course, was teaching people to draw them to liberation from the world of samsara, to draw them to moksha. So it's very important to him that his students understood that path and were able to leave the world of superimposition, as he called it, behind, the world of samsara behind. But I'm not an Advaitin teacher. I'm a university lecturer. And we do something different. What we hope is that we'll help our students to understand that tradition as well as is possible without actually becoming a member of that tradition, though of course if I have students who are members of that tradition, that's absolutely great. Because, and I think the fact that you're here in this church tonight shows that you appreciate that fact. It is so important that we understand one another's traditions. Because otherwise, ignorance and terrible prejudices and stereotypes grow up. And it's amazing how drawing students in to learning about another tradition suddenly makes them think in a completely different way. It makes them realise that their way of thinking isn't the only one. And it makes them question their assumptions and start to see why people think and do things differently, even while we share all sorts of other things together. And so from my point of view, I can't think of anything I'd rather be doing than teaching students. It's a real privilege, and it's lovely to have you here today. I'm interested then in Shankara's teaching because it takes him and his text seriously. He took teaching seriously, I want to take him seriously, so I take teaching seriously. He's very explicit that the Upanishads teach us in particular ways. They don't just happen to go da-da-da. They know what they're doing. They're good teachers. And that's something I as a teacher can learn from. And so I will teach my Indian philosophy course in a different way from the way I'll teach an Indian storytelling course there. Because these Indian teachers teach me that you adapt your teaching methods to your pupils and to the subject that you're actually talking about. But at another level, it also helps me with Indian colleagues, and this is very important that it is with Indian colleagues, to actually challenge some of the stereotypes that have grown up about Indian teaching methods, about traditional Indian teaching methods. And here, those of you who are older, I just ask you to maybe go back in your own thinking, to think about how you were taught in school, whether that was in India, in the UK, or anywhere else for that matter, East Africa perhaps. But wherever it was, how were you taught? You can think about how you're taught as well. What do your teachers actually do? Do they? I bet you're not this quiet in school. And it helps us to question stereotypes about what Indian teaching is and should be. And it helps us as well to teach students who come from India to do our courses who may not be used to the UK system. And bring with them a set of expectations. And it also helps us to teach our students, whatever their background, who come through UK schools, who've actually, how can I put this tactfully? Learned some pretty bad habits about what learning is about. So, what are these stereotypes I'm talking about? Teacher knows best. Now I have to say that like all stereotypes, there's quite a lot of truth in them, but unfortunately there's some negative sides as well. So of course, teacher knows best. The teacher knows best is a perfectly reasonable view to take, because your teacher does have more experience, does actually know more about the subject. That's good. So when Deepa teaches you dance, you know that she knows more than you. That's why you come to learn from her. If she didn't know, she couldn't do the blessing. I don't know, Deepa, can you actually make that blessing sign? You know, do you think she knows how to do a lotus? Shall we ask her? All right, show us the lotus.
Is that correct?
Okay, you can all make the lotus now. Yeah, come on. Beautiful. Okay, and you've learnt it because Deepa knows how to do it. So teacher knows best, absolutely, sometimes. Teachers should be respected. Yes, of course, and that's a terribly important thing that we should learn from them. Indian values, and I think most UK classroom teachers would love it if their teachers gave them the kind of respect. Okay. Also means that you go on learning all your life. And that, I think, is a terribly important thing about Teacher Knows Best. And I learned that really powerfully the first time I went to India. And I was studying for a while at the Ramakrishnan Institute for Advanced Philosophy in Madras, as it was then, Chennai. And I was working with Professor Vijanathan. And he said to me, "How often do you read texts with your teacher?" So I told him, and he was absolutely horrified at how little it was. And this is a man in his 50s at the time. He said, "I read the texts with my teacher twice a week." Still respecting his teacher, still knowing that he could learn from his teacher. Teacher knows best. Yes, absolutely. But it can have a downside. And the downside is, if you think the teacher knows best, you stop thinking. Right? Because teacher knows best, so I don't have to think. It can have another downside. It can make you unwilling to try new things. Because if you're a teacher, and that's how it's always been done, then that's how I must always do it. And so it can close your mind to actually new ways of doing things. And in fact, Shankara would have had a fit at those negative ideas, because he was absolutely keen on questioning and on taking risks and on being intellectually engaged with what you were doing. So the notion that you should just do it because the teacher says so and there's no other way of doing it is absolutely foreign to Shankara and to many other Indian teachers. But it has become a stereotype. And it's also become a stereotype in UK schools as well, in all sorts of ways. But not with the respect that goes with it, generally speaking. Okay, what's our second stereotype? Rote learning is the proper method. Okay? You learn to repeat things. Yeah, over and over. Okay, put up your hand if you've ever learned something by heart by rote learning. Okay, most of you, I bet that's how you learned the prayer, wasn't it? Yes, you went over and over and over it until you learned those words. Okay, and that's good, because it meant you could share that prayer with us and we could enjoy it this evening. And rote learning is often very good. Okay, who knows their 4 times table? Okay, right, now then. We better have a demo here. I think we better have 3 of you come out here and do a demo. Go on. Sorry, I don't know your name. Alika. Alika. Right. Alika, Sanjana, and Kirti, are you going to try? Okay. It's always dangerous doing things like this. All right. Now then, do you all know how you're going to say your 4 times table?
4 is 4. 2 times 4 is 8. 3 times 4 is 12. 4 times 4 is 16. 5 times
Okay, it's all right. I think you know it pretty well. That's good. Right. Now you see, they've partly learned that by rote, and it's terribly useful. My children are extremely resistant to learning their tables by rote. And they weren't taught to do it like that at school. They were taught to go 4, 8, 12, 6, and then go, oh, how many is that? Whereas if you learn it like that for the rest of your life, it's how I learnt it in the bath when I was a little girl with my mum.
And they have learned it from 3 different schools. They're coming from 3 different
That's
schools.
very interesting that you've learned it from 3 different schools. Yes, so maybe it's coming back in. Rote learning has its place. If you learn poetry, rote learning has its place. The reason why we have the Veda transmitted to us in incredible accuracy was because of the amazing rote learning systems. When I do this with my English students, I write the cat sat on the mat on the board. Okay, and they can't really grasp that you learn the cat sat on the mat by the cat sat on sat, the mat the cat sat on sat. Alright, you do it backwards and forwards in all sorts of different ways, and you don't then make mistakes because it gets really jammed up here. And many, many modern scholars, even scholars who study oral traditions, don't believe that Indian traditions can be passed on with that degree of accuracy because they've never done it. And they don't trust oral memory because they know that when you tell a story in lots of different ways, and it won't be word for word. That's very different from the way the Vedic texts are. So I'm not rubbishing rote learning, but it's another one of those where it's not enough. Because what are the problems with rote learning? Oh yeah, you actually absolutely have to. It's something we always say to our students. If you want to learn a language, you've just got to do it. You've just got to chant your Sanskrit paradigm. You don't necessarily understand it. And that's the key thing. And again, Shankara would have had a fit at that notion. He really, really didn't like people learning texts that they didn't understand. He was very keen that people should engage with texts that they actually understood. All right, that's our last one. Copying shows respect. Okay, you're making a horrible face there. You're wondering why you're making a horrible face. Come on, you've got to explain your horrible face. Because you don't believe it. You do believe it. You don't understand it. Right, that's fair enough. Okay. You don't understand it. Why on earth should copying show respect? Well, it is absolutely amazing the number of students I have who say, oh, we can't put it in our own words because so-and-so's the expert, and so we'll just copy what they put because that must be right. And this is UK students, and I have to say it's often students from India who have been taught that the best way of offering respect to your teacher is to replicate the teacher's words word for word, because the teacher knows, and therefore what you do to give respect to the teacher is to replicate those words. When you say to me, yes, but I don't want to know that, I want to know what you think, I want to know how you're engaging with it, it really frightens them. It frightens a lot of my students as well, who have been taught the appalling... Kitty, did you want to say something?
Well, they say copying is not nice because if you copy them, they think that they don't like your idea, but it's actually that they like the idea and they think that it's nice to copy them without making that.
That's very brilliantly put, actually. Did everybody hear that?
Yeah. Can you please repeat it? Can you please
Kitty, come here and just speak near my microphone and then come right here, then my mic will pick up.
It's better to copy because they might think that we like their idea.
Exactly it. Yeah. So she said just now you might think that they didn't like you if they copied you. But actually, what is it? Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. Yeah. Okay, and you're right there. Now, of course, Shankara, of course, held in great respect people who'd gone before him, and he quoted them. And that's very good practice. We like our students to quote. What we don't like is for them to lift chunks and pretend it's theirs. And I hope that none of you go to schools that do this. It's my least favourite form of student work. You go on the web, and you put a word in Google, and then use that nice little copy facility, and then you bung it into something that you're doing. It's like a cut and paste. I'm sure you never do it. My poor children from this age, from about your height ever actually, were told never ever plagiarise. And one day, my, I think then 10-year-old, was in a class and they were doing a project on Victorian. And they were cutting and pasting stuff and putting it into their class book. And poor old Sarah put up her hand and said, I don't think you should do that, it's plagiarising. And her teacher said to her, do you know what plagiarise means? And Sarah said, yes, it means copying and thieving other people's work. And the teacher went, oh. Now, if you'd been the teacher, what would you do? What she actually did was put it to a class vote. And the class actually voted to use that material, with the exception of my daughter, of whom I was extremely proud, who resisted the temptation to copy and paste. So copying can be very, very bad, because it makes you very lazy, and it doesn't make you think. And Shankara wouldn't have liked that kind of copying at all. So yes, you're absolutely right, Kitty. You do use other people's words to show respect to them and show that their ideas were good. And nowadays you put it in quotation marks and you say where it comes from. Shankara didn't need to do that because if he quoted a bit of the Upanishads, he knew that his audience would know where it came from. They recognised it. Just like if I came into this church on Sunday morning and I said, in the beginning was the word, people in the church would know where it came from. I wouldn't have to tell them that it came from the beginning of John's Gospel. Yeah? So, and we've all got things stored in our minds like that. And Shankara's pupils and the people he talked to would have had a huge number of these texts actually up here that they would have recognised. Okay, let's find out what methods Shankara uses when he's teaching them. Right, okay, stop that. He's going to use questioning, and I'm going to come back to that because I think actually it's one of his most important contributions to us nowadays. So I'm going to come back to that one. Right, are you ready for the next bullet point, girls? Okay, the next one is...
Sorry, before I could ask a question, is it okay or do you want to reserve questions?
You're more than welcome, Ganesh.
So, you know, you talked about Vedas and Upanishads now and about teaching. There is also this notion that a lot of these sounds are themselves sacred and have an impact.
Yeah.
So, you know, you pay obeisance to the deities, it has an impact on the surrounding environment, and even if you didn't understand what it was, just repeating it faithfully has an immense positive impact.
Yeah.
And that's why, and in a lot of Hindu festivals and these things are chanted, even though people didn't understand it.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's actually something that in another context I make very, very clear to my students, because actually we're obsessed in the way about understanding texts, and what we don't understand is that texts also have functions. And things like Om, Swaha, Swaha, it's a very clear example of a text that has a function. It doesn't mean something. The Gayatri mantra, Om Bhurbhuva Swaha, it doesn't mean something, it does something. And in fact, one of the things, I wouldn't dare do it in an audience like this, because it would be extremely pretentious of me. But with my students, I don't know whether you've heard me doing this before, but I will actually chant Om. And you had some very, very beautiful sounds when you were doing your, okay. And you would be amazed in any class of any students that you do it with, the atmosphere in the room just changes. And that, more than anything I could say to them, tells them what Ganesh was saying, that these syllables have effects, and they can actually sense that really, really clearly. But tonight I'm talking about the other side of things, which is the importance of understanding text. But what you say is incredibly important. Yeah, come to another session. Okay. So he uses examples. Okay, let's have the next. Right, I need you with your visual aid. Different. Is the space in each of the girls' pots the same or different?
No, there's nothing.
Okay, come on, Conchita, what are you saying? What's your reply?
Depends if there's something in the pot.
No, show them the pot. Okay, absolutely nothing in the pot whatsoever. An empty pot. Okay, is the space the same or not? Okay, there's quite a few nods from people with an Advaitin tendency. Okay. All right, one of you who's nodding, why would you like to justify your view? Why is it the same?
Space is space.
Space is space. Okay. We'll come. What's the pot doing then?
It's just showing the limit of the space. But the space is obviously limitless.
Okay, so the space is the same, but the pot is limiting the space. Okay, now, that's an Advaitin view of understanding us. Okay, so you're the clay pot now. Imagine yourself as the clay pot. Yeah. So, your consciousness, your Atman, is the same as the person next to you, in the room. The only thing that makes you different is that you have got a clay pot, a body of mind, which is limiting off that principle of consciousness. Now, in fact, don't worry, those of you who didn't say yes, who said no. Okay, Deepa, why did you say no?
Because they would know better for themselves that the space inside that girl's glass is different from the space inside the other girl's glass. They would say that themselves. It doesn't need me to say it.
Okay. Well,
because that is defining.
Okay, so it's defining. So in fact, there are lots of other thinkers who would agree with Deepa. Let's take Ramanuja. Ramanuja would agree. Right? Each of us has an individual Atman, an individual self or principle of consciousness, which is dependent upon Brahman, ultimate reality, but nonetheless we can tell the difference of ourselves from Brahman. Okay, so now then, this one actually is just going to need me to give my room to my husband so that I don't lose it. You don't mind if I do this. Sometimes my students get really horrified. They say, do you take your wedding ring off? Yes. I'm going to put it back on again in a minute. All right. Who's going to be... You can hold it. No, you can hold it. All right. All right, hold it up for them. All right. Right. What's the wedding ring made out of? Gold, yes, probably. But it's some carat gold. Okay, let's presume it's pure gold. Okay, is the ring the same as the gold it was made out of? Are these clay pots the same as the clay it was made out of, or is it different? Right. Why is it different?
Because the gold is a treated heat and costs a lot.
Okay. What about the clay pot? It's been changed. Okay. All right. You're another good Ramanuja type person. Okay. Real change. All right. But some of you are saying no. It's exactly the same. All right. It's nothing other than the clay. The material out of which it's made. Sorry about the polystyrene, but you've got to use your imagination. This pot is nothing other than the clay. This ring, hold it up for me, is nothing other than the gold. We are, in an Advaitin view, nothing other than Brahman, ultimate reality. Some of his examples. Let's have the next. Is it a rope or is it a snake? Brilliant photo, isn't it? I was really pleased to find out. Okay, of course it's really a rope. It's really a rope, but you go into a dark room, you see something curled up in the corner, and you think, oh, it's a snake. What do you do? Run. You run. You get out of the way. Shankara says, that's just like the world. The world is really Brahman, but we misunderstand it. We think it's really a world of multiplicity, a world of differentiation. There's a rope, we think it's a snake. There's Brahman, we think it's a world, and it makes us afraid. There's lots of things in the world that make us afraid. But when we know that everything really is in Brahman, then we move on here. When we know it's not a snake, we don't need to run away, do we? You wouldn't run away from a rope, would you? But, well, we think it's a snake. Exactly, in all sorts of other ways. So, right, the clay pot comes from the Chandogya Upanishad. The rope snake's actually a Buddhist example, but Shankara takes it and uses it for his ends. Okay, let's have the next one. So he uses questioning girls, he uses examples, he uses stories. Now, I've already given you a story. Do you remember what my first story was about?
Yeah.
Da, da, da. Well done, you see. Why do you think Shankara taught using stories? You can remember them, you can relate to them. Okay, here's another one. There were 10 men, and they came to a river, and they had to get to the other side. And they managed to get to the other side of the river, and they thought, we better make sure that everybody got over the river. So, okay, now then I think we better have all of you lot. All right, we're going to cross the river now. Okay, so this is the river. We're going to cross the river over here. Okay, come on. Right. Do you think we better get a boat? Yeah, I think we better get a boat. Come on. I can't row. Can anybody else? All right. We're over the other side of the river. Well done. You've got to get the side. Come on, quick. We need to get over. Now, I think there were 10 of us to start with, so I'm going to count up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh, well. We've got something happening in there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. We must have lost somebody. Let me count again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. No, there really are only 9. What happened to the other person? Silly me, I forgot to count myself. That's what the 10th man said. And when he realised, the penny drops. And he went, oh, it's okay. There were 10 of us after all. Right. Sorry, you can go back to your seats now. And Shankara says, that's just like when we suddenly understand what Brahman is like. We are nothing other than Brahman. It's that lightning change of perception. And suddenly we see things in a completely different way. So, old folk story, he uses it to illustrate his teaching. Now he uses what I call interiorization techniques. Now this one you have to be prepared to feel really silly. Okay, I'm prepared. Right, can we have the next thing? What's that? It's an onion. Okay, now for my English students, I call this the onion skin meditation. Alright? Those of you who know the Taittiriya Upanishads will know it's in terms of the 5 koshas or the 5 sheaves. Alright, now you're going to have to sit. Does Deepa teach you how to sit very, very nicely? Alright, so you're going to have your back, yes, straight, back in, that's right, bottom in the back of your chair, if you can. I know your legs are a bit little on these chairs, aren't they? Alright. Now, you're going to close your eyes because it's much easier to do this without feeling stupid if you've got your eyes closed. And what I'm going to ask you to do, you have to do it as well, grown-ups, is to imagine that you're peeling away these layers as I mention them. Okay? So I'm going to close my eyes so that you don't feel embarrassed. I'm not looking at you. Okay? So first of all, the Taittiriya says, peel away the sheath of food. And by food, the Taittiriya means your body. So imagine your body has disappeared. And now the Taittiriya says, peel away the sheath of breath. So isn't that breath which is keeping you living at the moment? That goes discarded. And now the Taittiriya says, peel away the sheath of mind, manas. That helps you to perceive things, see, hear, touch, taste, smell. And now peel away the layer of vijnana, understanding, the thing that helps you think about things. And now you've got down to that 5th layer right inside, just like in the onion, the layer of bliss. And Shankara says, you've got to even peel away that layer of bliss. And that which is deep within, that is Brahman, that is yourself. Just come quietly back to the room if you've gone somewhere deep. And those techniques are part of the way he draws the people along the path. And then he does a lot of grammatical analysis, which fortunately for you, I'm going to move swiftly on from. And if you're interested in it, come and sit in my Indian philosophy course, because that gets a bit technical, especially if you're this age. But one of the key phrases that he takes for grammatical analysis is that key phrase from the Upanishads, from the Chandogya Upanishad, Tattvamasi, that you are. It's not at all obvious. Okay, right, you're the teacher. Okay, you're the teacher. Now, you're just going to ask her one simple question, okay? So, and you just have to answer them, but you have to give them a different answer each time, and you're just going to ask her in turn, right. Alright, okay, so pupils come over this side. In fact, they're debaters in a public debate competition, because in India, status was often gained by winning debates, okay? So, here is, let's call her, we'll give her a male name, let's call her Yajnavalkya, who was one of the most famous sages in the Upanishads. And Yajnavalkya, look quite unlike Shankara, who's shown sitting there in the forest. Yajnavalkya liked owning cows. He often got thousands of cows. Well, why did he like owning cows? Cash value, absolutely. Wealth. All right, wealth. All right. So you're a very, very important teacher. You know, they very rarely catch you out. Okay. Now, we're not going to quite use the question they asked Yajnavalkya because this lot haven't been primed. It wouldn't be fair. Okay. So you're just going to answer the most obvious thing that you can think of, and then the next, and then the next. Okay. All right. Now, here are a variety of sages who come to test out Yajnavalkya and see whether he really does know his stuff. So come and ask your question. A teacher. Okay, good. Just the same question. involuntary has gone backwards here. He started with a teacher, gone to a human, and gone to an animal. But you weren't very well crossed. What's fascinating if I do this one with my students is that they almost always answer, first of all, with their name. And they'll almost certainly tell me that they're a student. They'll almost certainly say where they're from. They'll almost certainly say something about, you said, go to Yama, the god of death. And so, of course, Nagiceratus was a good son, so he did what his father told him. And he went to Yama, the god of death. But Yama wasn't in. Yama was out. And Nagiceratus had to wait for 3 days. Yama, of course, is a Brahmin. And it's pretty unacceptable not to offer hospitality to your guest. And Nagiceratus had been sitting there for 3 days. So Yama said, okay, I'll give you 3 boons. You can choose 3 things, okay, to make up for the fact that I wasn't here. And so Nagiceratus asks him 3 questions. But what Nagiceratus really wants to know is, what is the secret of immortality? And he asks Yama the first 2 questions, and Yama tells him the answers, and he's quite happy. And then Nagiceratus goes, well, what is immortality? What's the secret of immortality? And Yama suddenly goes, ask me something else. Now, why do you think Yama said, ask me something else? Not that. Because he's the god of death, so... Yes, exactly. He won't have a job. I like that. He won't have a job if he gives away the secrets of immortality. So he really doesn't want to go there. Brilliant. Okay. But eventually, of course, Nagiceratus gets it out of him. He gains the teaching, and he understands that probably Vishnu in that text actually, that Vishnu is the end of everything. If we understand that Vishnu is the end of everything, Vishnu is Brahman. Also further teaching about self-control and mental discipline and so on, then that is the secret of immortality. But why did Yama teach Nagiceratus?
He was ready.
Because he was ready. And because he asked. He knew what questions to ask because he was ready. And Shankara makes a great deal of this. And he says, you must let the student ask the questions. Now, I've been really not letting you do that for 5 minutes. So, genuine questions are very important. Pupils should question to the end. A good teacher is necessary, but lost story. Right, I need the king of the gods and the king of the asuras, the king of the demons. Yes, do you want to come? Which would you like to be, the king of the gods or the king of demons? King of the gods, good choice. Okay, yeah, did you want to come and be the king of the demons? Okay, come on then. You come inside. Now, the king of the gods and the king of the demons didn't like one another very much, and they both wanted to get the teaching. They'd overheard this teaching, and they wanted it because they realised it would give them power. So they came to Prajapati, who was the lord of creatures, and said to them, will you teach us? Well, Prajapati didn't say anything. 32 years later, you've been sitting around for an awfully long time, and eventually Prajapati says to you, what do you want? Why are you here? Now, Prajapati was a very good teacher. He wasn't just a terribly rude man. Anyone guess why he let them sit there for 32 years before he said, why are you here?
Because they were like willing to wait to get the answer, and they just like go after another.
Yeah, absolutely that. And he also realised that they were terribly jealous and power hungry. And he realised that they had to overcome that. Okay, so you've actually become slightly nicer, okay, in 32 years, so you're here. Okay. And so he teaches them, he gives them the first bit of teaching. He says, the person who is in the eye, they want to know what the self is. The person who is in the eye is the self. And they really don't understand what he's jabbering on about. Do you understand what he's jabbering on about? No, you were in good company, because neither did they. Okay. So he says now, look in this bucket. Okay, come here, look in the bucket. This is a pool of water. All right, what do you think? Aha. What do you see? You see yourself. Okay. You said, okay, that's it. That's the self. And they went away. I can go that way. You can both go together. Oh no, actually, you can go that way. That's a good idea. All right. Now the king of the Asuras went, ooh, that's good, isn't it? The self is me, and I'm going to get immortality because of that. Great. So Varachana went back to his kingdom, and he ruled his kingdom, and he thought he'd got it. Okay, so I'm afraid, Kitty, you have to go and sit down. But Indra, hold on a moment. Right, no, then. Your beautiful coat. Is that good, right? Ah, fantastic! Oh, I'm glad we did. What a wonderful teacher. Right, now look at it again. Do you notice any difference? What do you see? Yeah, now you can see your t-shirt. Whereas before, what could you see? Yes, but you could see this as well. You could see your coat. And so Indra went, hold on a moment, that's a bit odd. If I take off my clothes, so I've got mud on my face, then what I see changes. But I wanted the teaching about the thing that doesn't change. Must be something wrong with that. So, come back to me and say, give me the teaching, yes. So how long do you think I'll make you wait this time? Yeah, not 32 years, you're right. Not 32 years later. Not 32 years later. Prajapati says to you, well actually the self is in dream. People have dreams, haven't you? Yeah, can you imagine yourself in that dream? You think it's you. So yeah, Indra, off you go. You think, okay, that's great, yeah. And then, no, you can't sit down yet. You've got a lot of work still to do here, Indra. There's a tough part you chose here. Indra, hold on a moment, that can't be right. Because I'm a different person in different dreams. So that can't be what changes it. Forget that. And so Indra makes him wait for 32 years. There's a certain amount of repetition in these stories which helps you to remember them. And then he says it's what you are when you're in deep sleep, when you're unconscious. That's the self, beyond all of your conscious thoughts. And Indra buys that, so he goes. But what does he say? Well, no, because that's not quite right, is it? Because then I'm not conscious. Something different. If I die, what happens? Then, so this is your last one. And said, okay, this time, how long? No, you're wrong. This time he decides he's putting through it long enough, it's 5 this time. And this time he teaches him that the self is that which is beyond all those states of consciousness. It's beyond waking, it's beyond dreaming, and it's beyond deep sleep. And this time Indra understands, and this time you can go away and go sit down. Who would like to take this to the lady at the back? Could you just put up your hands so that we can see you? Okay, thank you very much indeed. Questioning. Because why didn't you and Varachana get the teaching? Because they asked the question. Why didn't Varachana come back? He was satisfied. He was satisfied at a lower state of the teaching, but each time Indra was dissatisfied. How does Indra become dissatisfied? It's exactly that, because he's reflected on the teaching. And this is one of the things that Shankara stresses time and time again. You can hear something, and even if it's the Shruti text, even if it's the Vedic text, you still have to reflect on it. And the reason you have to reflect on it is quite simple, that the Upanishadic texts themselves show pupils reflecting. They give us the model for reasoning on the basis of the Vedic text. They don't ask you to just take it on trust. They ask you to reflect and make it your own. And that's a terribly, terribly important lesson for all of us who are teachers, in any capacity at all, to encourage those students to reflect on our teaching, critically if necessary, and to make it their own. So, pupils must reflect, not just parrot information, and truth-telling is important to a teacher. This is one of the most wonderful bits of Shankara's commentary. I just love it. That story comes from the Chandogya Upanishad, and in it, Shankara has a question. He goes, hold on a moment, that's a bit off, isn't it? Well, he doesn't exactly say that in Sanskrit. I think he says, but that's what he means. How? Why? What? You know, something's going on here. Prajapati lied. Prajapati told Indra and Varochana that the self was the body, and that's not true. How could he do that? A teacher must tell the truth. Now where are we going to go with that one? Shankara says, no, he told the truth, because there is nothing other than the self, but the pupil just didn't understand in what sense it was true. And sometimes pupils need to reflect retrospectively on what we teach them and see how it all fits together. So what can Adi Shankara teach us about teaching? What can we learn? We can learn, I hope from this evening, that rote learning isn't enough, nor was it the norm, not just in Shankara, but in many, many classical texts. We can learn that from Shmitiketu, an arrogant young man who went and did his Vedic study, he'd done all his rote learning, he came back and his dad said to him, have you asked for that teaching by which the... never remember what all those questions come in, please never had it from me. The ununderstood becomes, the unthought becomes thought, and the ununderstood becomes understood. But there's one before that. What's it? Anyway.
By knowing which all else becomes known.
By knowing which all becomes known, that's right. It's our clay pot example. Shmitiketu went, don't be stupid, Dad. How could I possibly do that? And his father teaches him. We can learn that we have to engage the student where they are. I didn't come expecting to do this like I've done it at all. Because I didn't know I was going to have all these wonderful people here. Right? Krishna engages with Arjuna with his questions, Prajapati teaches the other. We can learn respect for both teacher and student, not just for the teacher. Respect for the teacher partly comes from respect for the student. We can learn that from the invocation that I gave at the beginning, and from another story which I won't go into now. We can learn that genuine open questioning is the key. Not closed questions, not just the question that's in the mind of the teacher, but what do you actually think? Nachiketa's of Yama and Shankara's 1,000 teachings to his pupils. And finally, we can learn that critical reflection is vital. And we saw that very nicely in the story of Indra and Varochana. I've learned loads from you girls. A teacher always learns from her pupils as well. Thank you.
Keep the picture.
Sorry. Am I meant to say, would you like to
Yeah,
ask
yeah.
questions?
Open for questions.
I'll switch back on again now.
Good.
Why did you give the title of the talk as Shankara's methods of teaching? Because if you read the Upanishads, the Upanishads follow all those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So really the teaching method came way back before Shankara.
Yeah, absolutely right. I haven't really focused as much on Shankara as I was going to this evening because I've had a younger audience. But Shankara is absolutely clear that his teaching methods are legitimated by the methods that are there in the Upanishads. And the Upanishads are not there just to teach you content, but they're exactly there, he says, as a compassionate mother, to give us the way of teaching and to help people. Thank you very much for that. Yeah,
How have the stories been going on since they were made?
How long have they been going on? Well, that story of Prajapati, both of those stories come from very, very old Upanishads. And depending on how you date them, maybe as long ago as 3,000 years, and perhaps the stories were even around before that. They're very, very old stories indeed. There's a perennial philosophy which is found across all traditions of the world, and that though they'll express it differently, in the end that they're actually getting at the same thing. And there were all sorts of reasons, historical, social, political, why Radhakrishnan was influenced to hold that view. So when he explains the Upanishads, for example, in his notes to his commentary on the Upanishads, he'll very often refer to Plotinus, who was a Greek thinker, to Latin thinkers and so on, showing what he thought were the parallels. And he would therefore argue, yes, there are fairly clear parallels. If you took the view, for example, of Jonathan Sacks, chief rabbi of this country at the moment, he's written a very, very good book called The Dignity of Difference. And he said one of the most important things that we can do in understanding one another is to understand that people do have different ways of seeing things and not to pretend that they're all the same. So then the question is, are there, in my view, any parallel traditions in Christianity and Islam? And it is certainly the case that if you're looking for the notion that in the end all that there is ultimate reality, then we find that in some Sufi traditions, and we find it in some Christian mystical traditions. And so there are certainly very, very close points of contact across religious traditions, which we very often simply don't see because we box everything up. But it's a very, very good question, and there's sort of several theses to be written. In fact, I've had a student who's just written actually on that. He is a Kurd, so his first language is Kurdish. He was brought up in Iran. He's lived in turmoil all his life. He came over here as a student. While he was here, one of his family members was shot. But he is an Islamic Sufi, and very, very much wants to dismantle the walls between people which we build up around Hindu, Muslim, Christian, and so on. So, yeah, it's a great work. Does the pupil help the teacher? That's a very, very good question. And I would certainly say from my own experience of teaching, yes. And that is why I love my job. Not because I get to sit and read books, though I do like doing that, but because I learn so much from my students. And students do help their teachers, yes. You help your teachers. If you've got good teachers, they will learn from you like you learn from them. Oh, that's a very, very good question. That deserves 2 of whatever the prize is. Did Adi Shankara have a teacher? Yes, in the hagiographical stories, he had a teacher who was called Govindacharya. And he had a teacher who was called Gaudapada. Now, in fact, probably historically, Gaudapada and Shankara were a little bit further apart than teacher's teacher. But yes, he did, and in a lot of his commentaries, in his Taittiriya Upanishad commentary, in his Gita commentary, and in 1 or 2 other places, he's very, very respectful to his teacher, and he writes verses of invocation to his teacher, so it's very clear that he respected his teacher as well. At the beginning of the Gita Bhashya, though, he does say, there are a lot of people who wrote on this, and they got it wrong, and now I'm going to tell you what it should say. So he wasn't afraid of being original either. That's an excellent question.
Do you know if there's any other countries besides India that honours the teacher?
Yeah, well, I think certainly my Chinese and Japanese students very, very respectful. In fact, I find it incredibly difficult. My Japanese students straight from Japan, you probably know there's a whole series of very, very complex bowing rituals. And because that's not my culture, I mean, I try and respond. But it depends on the circumstance as well. But yes, very, very much so.
There's a particular day in India where they do honour the teacher.
Yes. The Confucian tradition is very, very respectful of the teacher. Yeah. Oh, Guru Purnima, yes, in India. But yeah, no, you get similar Buddhist festivals actually in Japan and China.
Any books on philosophy, religious philosophy written by Westerners, I never have found anywhere any mention of Shankaracharya or the other gurus you have mentioned and their teachings. Is it only my observation, or do you also find this?
Right, I mean, I
think
they
are ignorant.
Yeah.
The Western philosophers, most of the time when I read their books, they are totally ignorant.
Yeah.
What has gone on long before their philosophy started.
Yes, it's one of my absolute bugbears. And there's a whole political history to it, basically, which we could talk about afterwards, so I don't bore this lot. Basically, in Europe, and America, you get a division from around the time of the 18th century, but we can trace it back to the medieval times, where religion and philosophy are split off. Theology and philosophy are split off. So you move from the Middle Ages, where Aquinas and the great universities in Paris, Oxford, and so on saw theology as the queen of the sciences. And then through the Enlightenment, you get a huge rejection of that notion, and the notion, therefore, that philosophy is a rational discipline that's not dependent on any kind of revelatory system or of notions of authority, which of course is highly specious. But anyway, it comes to govern the West. So then, if we skip swiftly to the 19th century, we get very much this notion, which is fostered by the German Romantics in particular, that India is the home of spirituality and the West is the home of rationality, which of course was a view that was very much taken on by many Indian reformers who both wanted to assert that India had something to offer, but also wanted to buy into part of the Western materialism package. So it gets very, very complicated, and then you get modern university departments being set up. And basically there is only one university in this country, to my knowledge, which in its philosophy department teaches Indian philosophy. And that is Sussex, and Janardhan Ganeri is the professor of Indian philosophy there. Everywhere else it's taught in departments of religion and theology, as though it's not proper philosophy. And of course the problem is that our system is predicated on the split between religion and philosophy, which is a split that I actually completely reject.
Because the Sanskrit word for philosophy is darshana.
Well.
So it's not really a correct translation. In the context we understand philosophy in the Western sense.
Yes.
So I think that what you said is absolutely right. That the darshana is not pure logical philosophy.
Though
it's related to life.
Yes, that is true, though in fact there is a huge amount of extremely abstruse logical philosophy that goes on in Indian texts. Navya texts. And the Western world has deprived itself of that knowledge by refusing to acknowledge that it does exist. I have a student at the moment who's working on the Madhva tradition and looking at some extremely complex texts that have been influenced by Navya Nyaya, the new logic school that came in from about the 11th, 12th century of Asia. And the only way that he can actually put those texts into English is to use the notation of symbolic logic. But he's got a very small audience. We're desperately trying to work, those of us who are in this field, to widen up that audience and to realise, A, we don't want to split off religion and philosophy, but B, that doesn't mean that there isn't some very, very hard-line rational thinking going on in these Sanskrit texts, which deserves respect for what it is. Yeah. Sorry, that's me getting distinctly on my ranting Bible.
Which one?
That will be the last question, so because I think one more, so last but one question and one more question.
Which one do you believe in or think is more like accurate, like Ramanuja's teachings or Adi Shankara's?
That's the next talk.
That's a very, very massive question. And then I would have to ask you, because a teacher, and Shankara makes this point often, a teacher can question the pupil to try and draw out what the pupil is really meaning. So I'm asking you a perfectly serious question actually. Do you mean which do I think makes more sense to me, or do you mean which makes more sense to the Vedic texts, or what? Can you sort of tell me a little bit more about what's behind your question?
Which makes more sense to like the Vedic texts.
Right, which makes more sense to the Vedic text. That's a very, very difficult one, because as a university lecturer, I would say the Vedic texts were composed over a very, very long time. They've got all sorts of very different points of view in them. And if you take some of those texts, then they very clearly are much more amenable to the kind of interpretation that Ramanuja gives. And if you take others, they're very, very much more amenable to the interpretation that Shankara gives. But of course, for Shankara and Ramanuja, their absolute fundamental principle was that the Veda teaches a coherent system, And therefore, it was their job to show how all of the texts could be explained within their particular take on those Vedic texts. If we look at the Brahma Sutras, for example, I think it's generally held by Indian scholars who know the texts very, very well indeed, that probably Ramanuja is closer to the underlying view of the Brahma Sutras than Shankara is. But I think Shankara does an incredibly brilliant job. Sorry, there was just one. What did Adi Shankara's students learn? What did Adi Shankara's students learn? That's a good question. Very good question. And in 1 minute, they learnt how to overcome this world of rebirth. And they learned that doing things to get things wasn't the important thing. Is that right? It's a very, very good question. We'll have to grow up and come to my university.
You have to wait for 20 years.
Not 32 years. Very mature student, man. Mature students always question, by the way, anybody else in here who wants to. Oh, they do. Oh, what happened to my last slide? Ooh. Have we packed it away?
No.
Oh my God!
Yes, this was a Sanskrit tradition in the modern world. I'm going to embarrass Advaita now because I'd like to pay tribute to all I've learned from both of them. They're there as both a student and a teacher in that role and in the university context as well. And I thought that was just a very good slide to end the evening on.
Thank you very much. And what a wonderful evening it's been. I mean, it's been really brilliant. You know, when Deepa said that Jackie is going to come up and talk to us, Dr. Hirst, but he's going to come up and talk to us about this. I was a little, worried because, would this be engaging? Would the people understand? And she's made this so delightful and engaging, not only for all of us adults, but for the children. It's been absolutely magical, I would say. So thank you very much for the evening. It's been excellent. The way you kind of expounded this very complex topic, it's been just fantastic. Deepa?
I think in true sense of what she has been speaking, she has given so many more questions that probably you'll have to come back on things like Advaita and Advaita and so many more as the questions have already come out.
And it is indeed true. A lot of us who come from this tradition have not had the benefit of this kind of teaching. Maybe we've learned a lot, we've read a lot, but this kind of clear exposition not only is good for us adults, but very, very important for children. I mean, I only wish that we have more of this, which is so open and accessible for children here and everywhere. I mean, this has been just wonderful. So thank you very much, and let me just call Vaishnavi to offer a token of affection to Jackie. Jackie, can you just come up and accept this? Please come over. This is a small token of gratitude, and thank you very much for the wonderful evening. So thank you very much for coming down, and once again I just want to end the evening by thanking our sponsors who made this possible. I mean, this is a no-fee program, as you know, and even the other programs in Upasana are very minimal in terms of entrance fee. This has all been made possible by two of our supporters. One is the Arts Council in the Northwest, and the Citibank NRI division, which is still there. So as you make your way out today evening, do talk to the city staff over there or take the brochures over there. Thank you very much for all of you, and have a safe journey.